So even in this new uncharted and unprecedented difficult time we find ourselves navigating, there is continuity, but not the kind of good continuity. I'm speaking, of course, about anti-Semitism and domestic extremism. Our guest this evening is an expert in the online radicalization and recruitment pipeline of some of the most insidious elements of American society today. And even more troubling are the refined and successful efforts of white nationalists and neo-Nazis to target our nation's veterans. Kristofer Goldsmith has been dubbed the neo-Nazi hunter next door by Rolling Stone. A veteran of the U.S. Armed Services and graduate of Columbia University, yes, the Columbia University, that is such a ripe bastion of free speech and liberal academic thought, Kris has experienced firsthand the ugliest of the ugly. Kris founded Task Force Butler, which I'll let him tell you more about. It is a 501c3 nonprofit which trains veterans in research and operations to counter extremism, teaching the skills and context necessary to keep veterans and their communities safe as they gather intelligence on dangerous individuals and organizations. His story is riveting and his experience and service invaluable to communities that are targeted by the growing numbers of individuals and organizations that threaten our safety and democracy. Our JCRC Executive Director, Sharon Brodke, is going to facilitate this informal community conversation with Kris and answer your questions. I'd like to thank Dr. Ari Cohn, the Harris Center for Judaic Studies, and UNL, and our partners at the Institute for Holocaust Education in making this evening possible. Without further ado, let's begin.
Thank you. So I used to introduce myself as the first and last investigator of any veterans service organization ever. Now I run an organization that trains veterans to become investigators. When I was at Vietnam Veterans America, I was working on the national policy staff, and my job was to work on things like GI Bill and healthcare and DoD personnel policy. But being the resident millennial in an organization by and for people in their mid-70s, naturally, they said, oh, government affairs, also communications. You're helping us with social media. So one day, logging into Facebook and helping them manage their social media accounts, I came to notice an imposter account. Vietnam Veterans America page that was 10 times the size of ours, had 500,000 followers. It was created 6 months ago. And I was thinking, man, we've got this member, this rogue member who looks like they might be in Europe, who's a brilliant marketer. They're posting pictures of our CEO. They built these websites that are posting information about veterans news and benefits. It's like, we've got to find this person and offer them a job. Well, after a few days of trying to figure out who this person was, I discovered I had a eureka moment where I realized that, oh, this is not a member. This is actually a hostile foreign entity. They published a 58-second video that came out of rural Massachusetts, a local NBC affiliate, I believe. And the true news story was that a black Vietnam veterans monument had been defaced. A truly outrageous story, but one that had come from rural Massachusetts that definitely didn't make like CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. It was a local story. But within 24 hours of that story being reported, this Facebook page, pretending to be my employer, had figured out how to manipulate Facebook's algorithm into believing it was a live video. So 58 seconds repeated over and over again and over again for 4 hours. And I watched it from its inception, as soon as it went live, to getting tens of thousands of shares. And part of the brilliance behind these respectable adversaries, I have to respect their talent, at least somewhat, is they had manipulated Facebook or manipulated us into responding to it, not just liking and sharing, but you know those little emojis, the hearts, and the angry faces that you see on Facebook? Well, if you engage in any content with that, it boosts it into other people's pages. So across the real chyron at the bottom of the news, it said, African-American Vietnam veterans monument defaced. Should the criminals suffer, yes or no? It was written in meme-style text above the video. Yes, angry emoticon. No, heart emoticon. So I watched as Vietnam veterans were manipulated back in 2017 into sharing what was actually Russian propaganda. Real true news story, but manipulated that way. It was made to divide us, divide Americans. When they picked that news story and brilliantly were able to turn it around within 24 hours, they realized that they had not just veterans, but they had Vietnam veterans. And they had black Vietnam veterans. And they had a monument, a sacred monument that was being defaced. Remember 2017, this is the same time that Charlottesville, right? What was that supposedly about? That was neo-Nazis coming to save a Confederate monument. So the Russians knew what they were doing. When I told my boss about my initial findings, he said, all right, you're now the chief investigator of Vietnam Veterans America, go find what foreign adversaries are doing. 2 years later, I came back with a report identifying the 10 different ways that troops, veterans, and our families are targeted by foreign adversaries online. And the common thread with everything from the Russians in imitating Vietnam Veterans America and other major veterans organizations to the hyper-targeted, hyper-local stuff like identity theft of Americans who were killed in war, to use them to engage in romance scams against Gold Star families. The use of this anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, anti-LGBTQ, and other hateful rhetoric, slogans like veterans not refugees or veterans before illegals, those were constant across all 10 categories. So I published this report, and my job was to study the way that foreign entities target troops, vets, and our families. Then I was laid off because of the pandemic. Donations dried up for virtually every nonprofit. I'm sure most people in this room felt that in some way. And I got the opportunity to study the things that I thought were most concerning. And that was the effects of this, not just foreign, but some domestic inspired extremism. And a buddy of mine that I served in the Army with had seen me working on the Hill, had seen photos of me at the White House and on the Capitol, and he had made assumptions about the way that power works in our country. He called me on that out of the blue. We had never had a conversation about this topic before. He said, hey Goldie, I joined a neo-Nazi organization. I want you to help me take them down. So I did. I joined Patriot Front, the most active neo-Nazi organization in the country right now, back in 2020. And now when he had used the term neo-Nazi, I thought he was using hyperbole. It wasn't until I was inside that I learned that they're not being ironic, that they are not being labeled. They describe themselves as National Socialists. They are studying the writings of Mussolini and of Hitler, and they are applying an Instagram filter to it so that it attracts young Gen Z, young men here in the United States. So after witnessing that from inside, I could not do anything else, and I built Task Force Butler. So In theory, this should go to the next slide. There we go. So our mission is to counter the rising fascist tide in the United States by empowering veterans and those who share their passion to stand against hate. I train veterans not to infiltrate neo-Nazi organizations quite the way that I did that first time, but to conduct surveillance online, entirely passive, and also to train communities like your own, so that when you see an act of hate, whether it's in person or you're finding a leaflet or you're seeing graffiti, the steps that you can take as individuals, you don't have to be activists, you just have to be alive to take your first steps towards countering hate. So we are a coalition of veterans and civilians going on offense for democracy. I am certain that everyone in this room has heard the phrase defending democracy thousands and thousands and thousands of times, particularly over the last 8 years. Well, if you're playing a game of chess or playing football or you're fighting in a war, if your only strategy is to just play defense, you lose by default. As soon as the other side takes an inch, they've won, right? So we are very purposefully positioning ourselves as going on offense. We want to put the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, in a defensive position. We want to exhaust their resources, their time, their energy, their money, their attention, so that they can't use any of those resources to come at us. So how do we do this? We take direct legal action against neo-Nazis. We put the word legal in bold and we underline it as often as we can on our website because the Nazis like to try to sue us. Everything that we do is legal. We are not the police. You do not have a First Amendment right to say whatever you want and not have us record it, right? We are aware of, whatever state we're in. I'm in the state of New York. If you say anything online, I, being based in New York, I can record it because it's a single party permission state, right? So we are always operating within the bounds of the law to make sure that every piece of evidence that we gather is courtroom ready. So we combine intelligence interception with violence prevention. What does that mean? So before the shooter went into the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, he posted on Gab, "Fuck your optics, I'm going in." Now, to most people, that wouldn't make any sense. They wouldn't know what that means. But I can tell you that that person was part of a community that was actively debating the optics around the alt-right. The alt-right is the branding that neo-Nazi Richard Spencer created to confuse us, to confuse the media, to confuse dictionary.com about how we define and identify neo-Nazis in this country. Right? The alt-right, we've seen that printed in every major media outlet. Alt-right is a term that doesn't exist. Alt-right just means neo-Nazi. It was branding created by neo-Nazis to make neo-Nazism more acceptable and to gaslight us into calling them something else that doesn't bring up the memories that is associated with their belief system. So what is our goal? Our goal is to make it as difficult and as expensive as possible to be a neo-Nazi. You have a First Amendment right to say hateful things, to do hateful things, but once you cross the line into criminality, you're ours. We're going to gather intelligence, evidence, we're going to record it, we're going to provide it not just to law enforcement, but also to community practitioners, to victims, so that they can hold you accountable, not just in criminal court, but potentially in civil court, and also basically in our economy. I mean, if you know a neo-Nazi lives in your town who's been identified, you don't have to serve him at your place of business, right? So we are about imposing legal, social, and economic costs. We ostracize these people from our communities. We make it difficult and expensive for them to choose that way of life. So what is the path of radicalization? How do we end up with neo-Nazis here in the United States? It starts with a base of conspiracy theories. we've all, seen figures like Tucker Carlson, formerly of Fox News, start to mainstream things like the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. The Great Replacement conspiracy theory is, I know many of you already know this, but I need to say it, right? The Great Replacement conspiracy theory is the idea that there's a secret cabal, a secret group that is replacing white Americans with black, brown, Islamic, and everything else, other different types of Democratic voting individuals. So while the Tucker Carlsons of the world have kind of gone like the hood off, straight up white supremacist on television, we've also seen massive conspiracy theories take over large parts of this country's belief system. We're all familiar with QAnon, right? Let me remind you what QAnon is about. QAnon is a conspiracy theory that Democrats are kidnapping children, are draining them of blood, separating the adrenochrome from children's blood and consuming it so that people like Democrat Hillary Clinton can live forever. That is the basis of the QAnon conspiracy theory, right? So when you see some maniac with a Q flag on their pickup truck driving down the highway, they believe that enough to advertise it. So when you've accepted some sort of conspiratorial thinking that is based in things like children being stolen or your family being replaced, that creates an existential fear. And existential fear for you and your family justifies violence. So these neo-Nazis, when they are ingratiated in these conspiracy theories, when they truly believe that their families are under threat, that they are under threat by this secret cabal, or the Jews, or the deep state, right? All of these three phrases essentially become the same thing. They find others who believe in this conspiracy theory, and they work together to plan to act. So when you see white supremacists who are of the alt-right brand, who are wearing khakis and blue polo shirts because they think that's more presentable, and they're doing these flash mobs through Washington, D.C. with their upside-down American flags, but not waving swastikas. You might be like, all right, why are they doing this like half-measure thing? What they're hoping to do is they're hoping to inspire the basement dweller, the neo-Nazi who lives in the middle of nowhere, who's in a place where guns are easily acceptable. They're trying to get him off the couch. So by doing their flash mob in DC, suddenly showing up without warning, getting into U-Haul trucks and disappearing, they're trying to get that basement dweller, that Pittsburgh shooter, to get out of his basement and go take action. So our process, Task Force Butler, we train volunteers to conduct original research. We support communities and journalists. We provide our research to community partners, to journalists, so that communities can be aware of the threats that are in their neighborhoods. And we communicate directly with the public. When we do a massive report on one of these neo-Nazi organizations, we let people know where they are, where they're active, and importantly, where the criminal behavior has happened. Because we are fighting to get district attorneys, attorneys general, police to take action. And our accountability partners aren't just local and state law enforcement. They are police departments nationwide. They're community advocacy groups like the ones that gathered here today. They're faith-based organizations. They are anybody who wants to combat hate. And what we are attempting to do, we're attempting to be force-minded. The community response guide that's on the table here, that's available online, taskforcebutler.org/community, is meant to help you understand the first steps that you need to take to combat hate in your neighborhood, right? When you see the spray painted swastika on the sidewalk, when you see the hateful sticker posted by Patriot Front on the lamppost, we tell you how to take a photo. We tell you who to give it to, right? It is, especially in the post-9/11 world, we all got used to hearing these slogans like, see something, say something. Well, that idea is good, but like, who do we say something to? What do we say? The community resource guide tells you how to gather the intelligence about the who, the what, the where, the when, why, and how when you see hate happen, and then what to do with it, not just give it to law enforcement, the FBI, the local police, but the ADL, the SPLC. We give you the direct links to the pipelines to submit it to, so that you're not left alone. And we emphasize that you are building your community, right? None of us are fighting hate alone. We are in it together. That is why you're in this room. That is why you're part of this community. So with this, I'd like to open it up to a broader discussion. And thank you for that.
So many questions. And I've had the pleasure of spending the afternoon with Kris and schlepping him around. And some interesting conversations in the car. It's not working, is it? Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about your service?
Yeah. So I was 16 when the towers fell in New York. I was born and raised in Long Island. I had always wanted to serve in the military. I was a Boy Scout, I was a Cub Scout. I'd always kind of had service in the blood. All of the veterans that I knew in my family participated in the Good War, World War II. It's pretty clear, like, good guys and bad guys in that, right? Not a lot of nuance in their war stories. I didn't have Vietnam vets who might have had some more complexity to talk about their memories of war. So when 9/11 happened, that was the first time that hate entered the picture. It wasn't just about serving my country anymore. Now it was about killing the enemy. Now it was about revenge. Now it was about New York. So I was 16 when the towers fell. I had a year and a half left of school. I graduated, signed the contract in 2003. I was in basic training by January of 2004. I joined the Army as a forward observer, which is, if you've ever watched Tom Hanks in a war movie, whether it's Forrest Gump or Band of Brothers or anything like that, you're going to see, or Saving Private Ryan, you'll see the infantry walking through a city or a jungle. They get ambushed, everybody lays down, and then there's a nerd with the glasses who's laying on his side yelling into a phone, and then things start blowing up. I was the nerd with the glasses who made things blow up. When I deployed to Sadr City, Baghdad, it was incredibly densely populated, and as a result, I could not do the job that I was trained for. If I had called in for a mortar strike, it would kill families, and we just could not do that. At the age of 19 years old, they kind of just made up a new duty for me and made me the on-the-ground intelligence reporter. It's not a real job, it was just an extra duty. And I ended up photo documenting mass graves. That was part of my job. So in between people shooting at me and occasionally, people would try and blow us up, that was what I was in Iraq for. It was a war that was started on lies, weapons of mass destruction, that right before I deployed, in what would be the third year of the war, they said, stand down, don't bother looking for the weapons of mass destruction, they don't exist, right? So I learned that the war was based on a lie, but I'm deploying anyway. I spent a year there being traumatized, and I came home even more angry. I had, despite a pretty negative experience, a stellar career. Made sergeant in 2 years, was well liked, was kind of the golden boy, performed extremely well with every test that the Army ever put in front of me. But after the experiences that I had in Iraq, I suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder at a time when PTSD was not really part of the American lexicon. I was suffering, and so was everybody around me in this infantry unit. So when we were doing things like all getting absolutely wasted every night and getting in fights, that was just normal to us. It wasn't PTSD. In January of 2007, I had 4 months left in my active duty contract, and George Bush announced the troop surge into Iraq. We were losing the war that I had been lied into. And now, instead of getting out in May of 2007 and going to college and going to live the rest of my life, the end of my contract date would actually be my new deployment date for a 16 to 18 month deployment. That's when the PTSD became completely unmanageable. I ended up having panic attacks at the age of 20 years old, thinking that I was dying. 21, excuse me, thinking I was having a heart attack. I ended up attempting suicide, and the Army interpreted that as misconduct. For that, I was kicked out with the general discharge. Thankfully, I still had VA benefits, healthcare benefits, but stripped of the GI Bill. So I ended up chewed up by the machine, pissed off, filled with hate, and dumped into my childhood bedroom. Went from Sergeant Goldsmith to Kris, living in my childhood bedroom, unemployable, not just because of the PTSD that was completely out of control and not yet diagnosed, but because my military records now looked like criminal history, because that suicide attempts they interpreted as misconduct. So I had little to be proud of, I had nothing to be proud of. I was extracized from my community, completely isolated, alone, and hopeless. But for having a general discharge instead of an other non-honorable discharge, which many more veterans got, I wouldn't have had access to the VA healthcare system that ultimately saved my life and gave me the opportunity to turn around and become who I am today.
Thank you. I think you kind of addressed this in your remarks just now, but we know why veterans are so valuable to these extremist organizations. But what makes veterans those people who have been deployed to fight for democracy and all of the American values which we hold so dear, what makes them so susceptible to these extremist ideologies and some of these groups that are totally operating contrary to American democratic values?
So I swore an oath to the Constitution at the age of 18. I had read it cover to cover, my little pocket Constitution, but I had never studied it. I had never been walked through each amendment and what it meant. I had a general idea from the culture that I grew up in here in the United States. I thought that I knew what it meant. And when I ended up in places like the anti-war movement, was the only community that of veterans that accepted me in that period of my life. I was very conservative. I was a Republican. The end of my military career happened during the presidential Republican debates that involved, McCain ultimately ended up winning, but Ron Paul was super popular for folks like me who had seen a ton of government waste, who had felt lied to by the military, by the government, who had felt failed by our politicians and our and the system. And in 2007, 2008, I didn't know what a straw poll was, or that there was a difference between a straw poll and who votes in that in Iowa versus a caucus or a primary. So when I saw Ron Paul coming away with 95% of every straw poll, and then he loses the primary a few months later, I was being told that the election was being stolen from him. And I didn't know the difference. I didn't understand that it was only the really kind of right-wing nutjobs like me who were voting in straw polls, who were participating in the online polls. CNN polls back then, they were just reported out. Any random person could go to CNN.com, or the Russians could go to CNN.com with a bunch of bots and vote for Ron Paul. And I could not understand, how did the most pro-war guy, John McCain, hadn't he end up winning over Ron Paul when the Iraq War at that point was universally unpopular, right? So there were a couple layers in that. I had felt lied to. I didn't understand the way that democracy works. I wasn't a sophisticated consumer of news. And I was angry. And I don't know that I ever met Stuart Rhodes, but I was literally in the same group that gave birth to the Oath Keepers. Stuart Rhodes, the convicted leader of the Oath Keepers, was a Yale Law School educated veteran with an eye patch who most people see him and think, oh, he that's Purple Heart. No, he shot himself in the face at a range because he can't handle a gun. But you see this Yale educated, right? You hear this Yale educated, you see the eye patch, you're like, that's a war hero, and he went to an Ivy League school to get a law degree. So when he's reinterpreting the Constitution for me, I have no reason not to believe him. I have a high school education and no chance of going to school. So why is it that veterans are vulnerable to these organizations? Some of them are in desperate positions like that. But Rand came out with it's not a complete study, but a survey recently, and talked about which found that veterans are actually less likely than the general public to believe in conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. It's a great headline for us, for veterans. But the fact is that the baseline for Americans is 1 in 3 Americans believe in the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. So beneath the headline, 28% of veterans believe that same conspiracy theory. It's a 5% difference, that's significant, but it's still pretty concerning. 1 in 3 people in our country believe in that. So it's not just veterans are vulnerable. It's the baseline of Americans are vulnerable.
That's shockingly scary. Can you talk a little bit about, you said that you got involved via Patriot Front and ended up in a Stuart Rhodes circle. Now we're talking about the new Apostolic Reformation and some of these groups that are not only emerging in the extremist environment online, but they have keys to the back door to their congressmen and senators. And we have the appeal to heaven flag displayed in the halls of Congress. How did that happen?
Yeah. So, first of all, the reason why I'm here tonight, and the reason why I do what I do, and the reason that Task Force Butler exists is because I believe that we have reason to hope. Like, fascism is real. It is not a historical anomaly from 100 years ago. It is something that is that the seeds have been growing here in the United States for a very, very long time, and they have not been weeded out. But I am here because I have hope. Even with a guy flying the appeal to heaven, a Christian nationalist flag, who's now the Speaker of the House, even though we've gone that close, the hope is not lost, right? So the purpose of Task Force Butler and where we hope to go over the next year, I want to emphasize we are a tiny, tiny little volunteer-based organization. We've got 1 paid member of staff right now. We're hoping to grow so that we can start creating outposts around the country so that we can get veterans who look like I do, who have multiple layers of privilege, right? I can walk into a gun range around here and nobody's going to look at me funny, right? I can, in any red state in the country, I can walk around and people are going to be okay with me. I've got tattoos below the suit. Our goal is to start placing veterans who are going to be collecting intelligence at places like town halls, where we see groups like Moms for Liberty showing up hand in hand with Proud Boys to get schools to ban books. Because out in the parking lot outside of those town halls, those Proud Boys, those Moms for Liberty, are harassing school board members and intimidating them into resigning from their positions so that they can create open seats so that Moms for Liberty can get elected, right? We are hoping that in the next year, we can start to have veterans around the country who will be in place in communities throughout the United States so that we can simply be there to watch it. And then we can use our platform as veterans. Again, you guys are all here because you're listening to a veteran today, right? That works. We can draw a crowd, right? So when veterans are coming to say, listen, we served our country, we swore an oath to our Constitution, and we are here to tell you that our democracy is under threat from domestic actors in a way that no Iraqi ever threatened us, right? We believe that through gathering intelligence and sharing it with the public, that we can help to preserve our democracy, no matter how threatened it may be.
Thank you. And that leads me, when you talk about white Christian nationalists and some of these folks who, on the surface, when we think of evangelical Christians, we think very pro-Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Now we are in this, as Zoe said, uncharted territory with Israel. And we have a lot of work to do with our young people in particular, who didn't grow up in the era of cast a giant shadow and Exodus and Israel being the underdog. But where does the pro-Israel white Christian nationalist intersect and diverge from, and what can we expect in this current climate, especially with the elections coming up and all the controversy around aid to Israel?
Yeah. So I want folks to recognize that we have limited time and we could write books on this. It's extraordinarily complicated, but I'm gonna try and give you the best truth that I can here. And Christian nationalists do not care about Jews. They care about Israel. And that is because they believe in the rapture. And they believe that Israel needs to exist so that the second coming of Christ can happen and praying Christians can evaporate into the sky. That is crazy. I'm sorry. I say this as I was born Catholic. It is absolutely nuts to believe that we're all going to evaporate into the sky because Israel is a thing, right? So I know that sounds overly simplified, but it is the truth. That is what Christian nationalists care about. They care about the evaporating into the sky part of the story, not the Jewish people. So with that said, there are multiple different sects of these like neo-Nazi adjacent Christians operating throughout the United States. Some of them, wield the cross and this identity as Christians or identity as nationalists, as white nationalists, because this has become politically acceptable in some, especially in some states like Idaho. There is no religious belief behind it. There is just the power of saying, oh, this is my religious belief. You have to accept what I'm saying because this is, I believe it, this is my faith. And they recognize that gives them power. That gives them an opportunity to say bigoted things, hateful things. We've seen it so much against the LGBTQ community. People saying, well, it's my faith that is making me a bigot. I mean, they don't say it that way, but you get what I mean.
Okay. I think at this point, I could ask questions all night, but I selfishly go ahead, Sarah.
So you mentioned at the beginning that your organization provides advice on what ordinary people who aren't necessarily, but could be veterans, could do, right? If you encounter hate out in the world. So if you see something, to whom should you say something? What should you do?
Yeah, so we have a couple of copies left of the community response guide that you can take home with you. But we designed it so it's available on your phone. If you go to taskforcebutler.org/community, we have a checklist in there. So it tells you, you can scroll to the bottom or you can go to the last 2 pages if you've got the printout. It tells you capture something like 3 to 5 images. We harp on images, not video, because clarity is key. Your iPhone is an incredible camera. It's a good video camera, but it's a better camera. We want to capture details. So say there's a hate group that shows up and they're protesting on the corner of the street. It is more valuable for you to take still photos and then submit it to the FBI, local law enforcement, the SPLC, the ADL, your local community center,
JCRC.
the JCRC, your community group. Those photos can be used by experts who might begin to recognize the bad actors behind the mask. I mean, being a member of Patriot Front, I became familiar enough with these people that they pull the white neck gaiter up over their face. I still see the shape of their face, so I know who they are. So there are experts at the ADL, the JCRC, the SPLC, who can take what might seem like a pretty obscure photo and make it, and find the identities of the individuals behind it. We also, we say in the guide, it's important to sanitize your images. You might be tempted, if you see something outrageous or scary, to take a picture and post it online right away, post it on Facebook. This is a deliberate tactic of the fascists. They're creating a spectacle, and they want you to take a photo of it and share it. There are two reasons. One is it makes them look bigger and scarier than they are. It spreads fear in your community. And two is because there's almost always some sort of website or QR code or just an aesthetic that helps their recruiting, so that when sympathetic people, who you may even be Facebook friends, see it, they see the website, they know where to go to find the hate group so that they can go through the recruiting pipeline.
Yes.
Can you circle back to that business about the replacement theory and how these folks can use the current immigration situation as part of their narrative?
Yeah, so one of the areas of specialty that we have is in a New England-based neo-Nazi organization called NSC 131. In our estimation, they are the most consistently violent neo-Nazi organization operating in the country right now. There are more active, there are much larger neo-Nazi organizations, but NSC 131 operating throughout New England is, I think, consistently the most violent. They picked up the habit in August of going to JCRC affiliated websites in and around Boston, or throughout Massachusetts, and they would see JCRC press releases about how this community was helping to house Haitian migrants throughout Massachusetts. And they would take that location from the JCRC website and they would make that a target. So NSC 131, this neo-Nazi organization, their thing is all black and they carry a swastika, like they're very explicitly Nazis. They would show up, as a flash mob style event outside these hotels. And, they might be there for 5, 10, 15 minutes, but they would get headlines across the United States for it. So this is an example very similar to these domestic actors are doing a very similar thing to what the Russians did when they first duped me, when they created this Vietnam Veterans account and they highlighted a true story about a black Vietnam Veterans monument that was defaced. And they amplified it and made it worse and put their framing around it, right? So these domestic actors have learned how to take a good story, a heartwarming story, a story about Americans who are standing up for refugees and helping them settle here in the United States. Like my community has been working to settle Afghan and Iraqi refugees for a couple decades now. And they've figured out a way to pervert it and turn it into something that they can find sympathy for, that they can spread racism for in more mainstream audiences. So what we have focused on with these stories, what Task Force Butler is focused on, is reframing these events for law enforcement. Because it's the beat cops, it's the ones who actually respond, who need to act in the moment. Because what's been happening is, even in a state as small as Massachusetts, where this neo-Nazi organization is infamous, and everybody knows who they are, and every beat cop knows who they are, the beat cops, at the end of the day, see a white guy. They don't see a gang member. But they're all wearing the same color, they're operating under the same name, they spray paint tags with their name, right? They're often dealing, this particular neo-Nazi organization has a bunch of members who've been convicted of drug crimes. They meet all of the elements of a criminal street gang. So when NSC 131 goes onto private property at a hotel and starts burning road flares and shouting threats, they've met all of the elements of felonies, but the beat cops don't get it, because they just see a bunch of white guys. And if they're white guys, they're not gang members. So what we are doing as veterans, and as a New Yorker, I can be a little rough, right? I can talk to a cop and I can say, stop being an idiot. If you saw him wearing a red bandana, you'd go, oh, that's the Bloods. If you saw him wearing a blue bandana, you'd go, oh, that's the Crips. If he's wearing a black bandana, that's NSC 131. They're all gangs. So just treat them like gangs. So what we are doing is we're just saying to cops, like, listen, just enforce the laws that are on the books. You don't need special laws to go after neo-Nazis. You've got gang laws, organized crime, just use that. So part of what we're doing here is not just gathering up intelligence and sharing evidence of criminality, we're also shifting the conversation for law enforcement and for local officials, and helping them understand you don't need special laws to prosecute neo-Nazis. Just go after them like the gang that they are.
I want to be on defense.
So Ari won't agree with me, but I think you should abandon Twitter or X.
I agree with you from my own
I have never in my life felt like I have given an inch to the Nazis, but for me, in my professional life, I had a pretty dedicated following that was interested in veterans issues and extremism. I've pretty much abandoned the app. When I accidentally open it, I immediately close it now. What has happened to Twitter is intentional. Elon Musk is a white nationalist. He spreads the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. He amplifies other accounts that do that. He's reinstated well-known, infamous, have been jailed for it, neo-Nazis. He's reinstated their accounts. That is not an information battle space that I think is worth fighting over anymore. It took me a long time. It took me a full year to get there. There have been other extremism experts who've been, saying this since day one of Elon's takeover. I only recently reached that point where I just gave up, and it was, I think, just before the war started. So I'm glad that I wasn't on it for that part. I think that, what I have learned, and this goes back to the Russians. When I was working at Vietnam Veterans America, there was this viral video that popped up, and it came into my feed before it came into most people's feeds. And it was what most of us saw as a man who appeared to be Native American. He was banging on a drum, and there was this smug-looking kid with a MAGA hat standing right in his face, just kind of smirking, smiling, right? Nothing really happened, but outrage spun. Well, I am quite certain that the Russians knew that I worked for Vietnam Veterans America and worked to get that in my news feed pretty early, and I participated in amplifying what ended up being just a bogus story. This Covington high school kid, not a good kid, he's a little rat. He ended up suing CNN, and now he's a millionaire because CNN participated in amplifying a nothing story. I didn't do any, even if there was some story there, which was, I think, some smug kid being rude to some old man, was as deep as the story ever got. there was no reason for me to react to that. There was no reason for me to amplify it. There's no reason for me to get Vietnam Veterans America involved. The guy was not a Vietnam vet, and he was tricky about the way he identified himself. He was a Vietnam Times vet. It wasn't until months and months and months later that we learned it was the Russians who it was like a bot account that got that video and injected it into feeds first. It was an account that Twitter months later deleted because it was an inauthentic account. I felt incredibly guilty for getting Vietnam veterans involved in that. I had a press release shot out, which no one really picked up. It wasn't a tremendous deal, but I did play a role in helping to lend credibility to that story, because journalists follow me because they want to know about vets and Vietnam vets at the time, right? So I definitely helped get it into some people's feeds that ended up writing about it. That is an extreme example, but that taught me a really strong lesson of you don't have to react. You just don't have to do it. If you are going to react, screenshot your enemies, quote tweet your friends. So if you quote tweet something outrageous, so you're putting your comments above them, you're amplifying the original message more than you're amplifying your own. Now, if you want to address disinformation or a hateful message, take a screenshot, cross it out, deface it with red arrows or whatever's easy, or a clown face. I usually put a clown face on someone I think is being stupid. I think that gets the message across. And then post that image instead. Because if you do the quote tweeting, if you do the reply, you're just pushing their message, not your own. So if you feel like you need to engage, that's the way to do it. Screenshot your enemies, quote tweet your friends.
Good advice, thank you. We also have some resources online since the war started that give you some tips and tricks of the trade in terms of when to engage with certain folks online, when not to engage. There are many who, to Kris's point, they're just looking for you to amplify their message. You are not going to win an argument with them, and you are not going to change their minds, nor are you going to change the minds of their followers. So be strong with your own positive messaging. Push that out. I know everybody feels so helpless in this time. And when I've said to people, use your social media, use your microphone, your voice, and people are looking at me like, really, is that all I can do? That's how social media works, folks. If one of your friends or followers picks it up and it resonates with them and they retweet, I'm off of X as well. I still refer to it as Twitter. But if they pass that along and share it across any other social platform, that's a win. That's at least one, maybe 100 people who wouldn't have seen it if you didn't share it.
Mm-hmm.
So, Ari?
Over the last
Yeah, so we include in our community response guide links to the ADL's glossary on extremism. So there's symbolism, so visual symbolism and phrases and words. The glossary is super, super comprehensive. It's frequently updated. That is, I'm not going to recommend to anybody that they scroll through it and just learn all the extremist stuff, right? If you're Ari, you're going to do it. If you're me, you're going to do it. I'm not going to recommend to anyone else do that. But that is it. The ADL, we're not going to create something that's already been built. We recommend the ADL's glossary on extremism. The SPLC also does long form reporting on extremist messaging to help kind of break it down into terms and concepts that the average person who doesn't immerse themselves in this stuff can understand. Which, admittedly, I read intelligence reports all day. Sometimes I forget what normal people understand about these things, and make assumptions about the symbols that people just understand. I don't know if everybody in the room is familiar with it, but 88 Tactical is, okay, I see some nods, right?
Say that again.
88 Tactical is the gun shop, gun range, neo-Nazi campus here in town. So Ari and a couple of his colleagues at the school have reported on this, how, at a certain point, if you're called 88 Tactical, if you're on like Highway 88, okay, that makes sense.
Okay, AD8?
88.
88.
Number 88.
8.
88.
88. So 88 is a code that is used by white supremacists to say Heil Hitler in public without people understanding it. So they put it in their license plates. They have the stickers. Now, Dale Earnhardt was number 88. He was a famous NASCAR driver. He was not a white supremacist, but that also gave space for plausible deniability. So people buy Dale Earnhardt well after his death. He's still a very popular driver. He's legendary. So people engage in games with us to gaslight us. So they will use these hateful symbols, and then they'll tell us, no, I just like Dale Earnhardt. I like the NASCAR guy. I don't have a Heil Hitler sticker on my car, right? So what Ari's asking about is like, how do you identify when it's a symbol of hate and when is it just a coincidence? Well, in the case of a place like Tactical 88, the dog who guards the place is named Panzer. They have, the elevation of the location written on the wall, 1488. 14 is 14 words. It's a white supremacist slogan that I'm not going to repeat. It's about white children. And it goes back to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Eventually, there are too many coincidences for it to be coincidences. And in the case of Tactical 88, like, as far as I'm concerned, that's a Nazi compound that's operating openly here in the state. And that is something that they're skating by on because they've blurred the lines, they've said it's a joke, they've said it's a coincidence. And until one of them gets caught saying something on camera at a gun range because a veteran's hanging out there who looks like them and doesn't necessarily appear to be a threat, for some people they're just not going to believe it's true because it sounds too fantastical.
It's on the it's on the Gretna exit.
Look, it's an I-80.
Yeah.
Right on.
I will say that they have reached out to us because they know they have an image problem. So we are going to be helping them. I don't see them rebranding necessarily, but maybe taking some of the dog whistles, like the eagle from their logo, the 1488 from their wall, which they claim they didn't even know what that was.
Didn't they bid on doing the security for the Federation campus as well, too?
No, they are not the security company
No,
for the
they-
Federation. They bid on it, sure they did. And they also have a 20-foot banner outside their location that says, "We stand with Israel." So I can tell you, I don't want to get into too much detail. They know they have an image problem. They were very concerned when the war broke out. They claim that they are not trying to dog whistle for the neo-Nazis in the area, and that they have good intentions and nothing but love for the Jewish community. And this is going to lead to a very interesting, crucial conversation with them in the coming weeks. So I love my job. Yes.
Can you address
Yep.
discussion? So I'm curious about the office.
So there is this is not new. This is like decades old. There is a very well established sharing of ideologies, sharing of bomb-making plans, of small unit tactics, of propaganda campaign strategies and tips between Islamic terrorists and white nationalists here and throughout the Western world, to include New Zealand and Australia. This new iteration of this war has created a recruiting bonanza. It's created a recruiting bonanza for this whole conglomeration of
Okay.
extremists.
For whom?
For all of them. For
The neo-Nazis?
the neo-Nazis and the Islamic terrorists.
Okay.
They're brothers.
They always have been. And again, this is a decades load. And to be honest, I'm just learning about this decades old connection. But the academics have been writing about it for longer than I've been alive. The neo-Nazis have been very, very deliberate. Neo-Nazi organizations, and let me kind of rewind. When I use the term neo-Nazis, I'm talking about National Socialists. I'm not branding people who are conservatives or who are even white supremacists as neo-Nazis. I'm talking about nationalist socialists. When I say white supremacist, I'm talking about white supremacists. I'm being very deliberate when I use these terms. They're not always interchangeable. So these neo-Nazis, well-organized groups like the National Justice Party, the NJP, a neo-Nazi organization here in the United States, has been going to protests. Forget about the last 5 weeks, let's go back to 2020. They were sending out provocateurs with hammers to go break windows and start riots. Because as soon as a window falls during a protest, it turns into a riot. They were the ones who were the agitators in the crowd. I saw them planning it in real time. I saw them doing it in real time.
This was the same thing in the anti-nuclear movement.
Yeah.
You have the RCP and the Communist Party coming to nonviolent demonstrations.
Mhm. And they're doing the same exact thing today. So they're showing up at places like my alma mater, Columbia University, and neo-Nazis who have nothing to do with the school, who may not even live near New York, are coming there to hold up a sign and condemn a whole bunch of protesters as just as heinous as they are.
They've got the liberal student body now joining them. That's the interesting.
So
part.
I'm being careful about our words. Liberals are not joining neo-Nazi organizations, right? I'm being very specific here. So neo-Nazi organizations are going to campuses like Columbia, and they are creating propaganda that we are all responding to, that we collectively as the United States are responding to. I left Columbia University as a student for 3 semesters because I faced a direct harassment campaign from neo-Nazis before I knew what any of this stuff was, before I understood that the alt-right was neo-Nazis. Fellow students of mine, American vets attending Columbia University. So I'm not defending the university reflexively. I left the school because of that direct harassment campaign. I did come back and graduate, but I had to leave because I very much wasn't safe. So these neo-Nazi organizations are creating these propaganda campaigns where they are doing what we're discussing now. They're blurring the lines. They're making us use the incorrect vocabulary. There is not a crowd of 100 neo-Nazis ever on Columbia's campus. There may be 3, there may be 5, but there's not more than that. Now I know from the experience that I described before what it feels like to be lied to and what it feels like to suddenly have access to hidden knowledge. when I was being told that the Ron Paul campaign was having the election stolen, I felt like I knew something that nobody else knew. And I went around and I created copies. I had no money at the time, but this reflects how radicalized I was. I was burning copies of this conspiracy theory DVD called, what was it? Zeitgeist, which I didn't recognize at the time, included hints of things like the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. In my mind, it was about how these invisible powers that be were stealing an election, right? I had no idea. I had never heard the phrase, the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. I had no idea, but I was participating in handing that out. I wasn't a neo-Nazi. I wasn't a white supremacist. But I was participating in something terrible. And I didn't learn about any of that. I didn't understand what I was doing until way after those times. You know, my first experience on Columbia's campus was as an anti-war protester. It was when I had fresh wounds on my face from bar fights because I was out of control and drinking all the time. And I was just yelling in people's faces because they didn't care about the war that my friends were dying in. They were students. They shouldn't have cared. The war was bullshit. What are they going to do about it? They voted, maybe. Or they weren't even old enough to vote, like, you know, the last presidential election, right? You know, and I regret my ignorance, but I can't change it. You know, I grew older and I grew more experienced. I did go to school. You know, I did have the time to have those debates and to learn. But these kids, they're still where I was. They're finding out about Palestine for the first time. They're finding out about Israel for the first time. And their first impression is making them feel like there was this hidden knowledge that was kept away from them. And they're responding to that. That is the thing. Because none of us are taught this history in high school. I mean, maybe this school is different. But I went to public school. I didn't learn about the foundation of Israel. I didn't know the nuance of it, right? We went straight from like Civil War to World War II. I never learned about the Korean War. I never learned, it was even through, I was political science. We didn't mention the Korean War once. If I didn't know a Korean War vet, I wouldn't know anything about the Korean War, right? So these kids feel like something has been kept from them, and that's what they're responding to. That's why they're so passionate, and that's why they're being stupid sometimes. And it's not going to stick around. They're not stuck in this moment for the rest of their lives. They're going to learn. They're going to regret some of the things they're doing and they're saying. And things will get better.
That's a pretty hopeful note to end on. Unless anybody has any other burning questions, I think I'd like to end on a hopeful note. Kris, thank you so much. Ari, thank you for bringing Kris to Lincoln and giving us the opportunity to ride those coattails. Thank you for today and for this evening. And I know you're writing a book.
Trying.
Okay, you're trying to write a book. We'd love to be part of that book launch.
Thank you.
And I think you're going to be hearing from people with more questions, and everybody take the resource guide. As Kris mentioned, there are ways to report things. I think we can run back to the office, Pam, and get the little QR codes. If you see something, say something. The suggestions that Kris had about taking still shots of some of these things, share them with us. We will also pass them on to the Anti-Defamation League. And what have I forgotten? Thank you.